Good morning, Thailand, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another week. I think we're on to episode number 31. Bill Barnett from C9 Hotel Works. Thanks for coming in.
Hi, Tim. It's Monday, and two Tims in the same day.
Yes, we've got a guest online, which we'll introduce in just a moment, who's also vying for the longest title. I think the guest we had on Friday, his title was about half an hour long. We didn't have any time for the rest of the show. Anyway, we'll get to our guest in just a moment. How was your weekend, Sandbox-wise?
Oh, I think we're trying to avoid that topic right now, but it's just fine. The weather's been really good here in Phuket, and it's good to see a lot of watchers today in from Koh Samui. You know, Koh Samui's got some news coming up later this month as well, so that's going to be a topic, I'm sure, in future programs.
And good morning to Kimberly in Waikiki. Wow. We've got somebody in the Gold Coast, Koh Samui, Kata Beach. You could have come into Waya Cafe and watched us. And we've got Omi in Bangkok. But all the way from Sydney in Australia, we've got Tim Shaw. He's the Canberra-based political journalist. He's also a board member of the National Press Club of Australia. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning. Good morning, Thailand. Great to be here.
Or is it good afternoon, Australia?
It's just turned midday, and we're currently 3 hours behind where you're broadcasting. But yeah, midday, Australian Eastern Standard Time in Sydney in lockdown. Yes,
we'll have a talk about all that in a moment. Tim, I'm just going to share with people the situation here in Thailand this morning, and we've got 6,166 new infections announced today and another sad 50 COVID-related deaths. 84 of those people are from Thai prisons. Bill, just looking, and Jay, you might like to bring up that graphic. This is the situation from yesterday, and we've still got a real concentration of cases up around the centre of Thailand, principally Bangkok, as we've mentioned, but also look at those figures in Nakhon Pathom and Nonthaburi, Pathom Thani, Samut Prakan, for heaven's sake, which is where the Suvarnabhumi airport is, and Samut Sakhon, all just immediately adjacent to Bangkok. So that is sort of the epicenter of the current problem.
And I think vaccinations in Bangkok right now are slow. There's a lot of issues over not enough vaccine to go around, and you see now the workers dispersing to other provinces from Bangkok, and that's a bigger issue as well. So you are seeing the Delta variant move around Thailand right now, so that is a big concern.
So before we get into the issues, Tim, would you just be able to update us quickly what the current situation with COVID is in Australia?
Yeah, good question. Just alone here in New South Wales or Sydney, there were 35 new cases announced only an hour ago. Most of those were in the quarantine or isolation in the family home. This current outbreak spread from a limousine driver that picked up some pilots from a FedEx jet on the 16th of June. And that limo driver became patient zero for this current, what we're calling a super spread. About 400 people have been infected. That has led, gentlemen, though, to a lockdown of the largest city in Australia, a population of 5 million people. That lockdown commenced on the 26th of June and is not scheduled to end until this coming Saturday. Most of those people are experiencing the Delta variant, the super spreading version of COVID. But just on the headlines, those deaths that you announced in Thailand overnight, since the pandemic started in Australia, March of 2020, 910 Australians have lost their lives, which is tragic. Every life lost is a tragedy. But the reality for us here in Australia is that we've had one of the lowest death tolls per capita, particularly if you look at our relationship with the United States, UK, Canada, New Zealand and Australia reporting very, very low deaths. But gentlemen, the problem we've got with that is that stroll to vaccination rather than the rollout and the urgency of vaccination. I guess we can tease out those issues.
Sure
thing. Here in Sydney, 35 cases overnight and most in home quarantine.
And Sydney's worse off than other parts of Australia?
Yes, because of that super spreader event that happened on the 16th of June. The nation's capital, Canberra, where I live, half my time, have had 0 cases of COVID outbreak for more than 12 months. Now, currently, it's mandatory to wear a mask in Canberra, but each state and territory, through their various governments, have been able to restrict the level of outbreak, and periodic lockdowns have taken place, border closures, and that's been a real impediment to the Australian economy, and then subsequently for the ability for Australians to be able to travel overseas sometime in the future.
All right, hang on there, Tim. We're going to have a quick break and we'll come back and sort of flesh out some of the issues. We should mention, of course, that Australians have been very popular tourists here in Thailand for quite a long time. We'll go through some of those stats as well. You're watching Good Morning Thailand, coming to you from the Waya Cafe. Got Bill Barnett with me here from C9 Hotel Works, and Tim Shaw from Sydney in Australia. And we'll come back to you, well, with more right after this. You're watching Good Morning Thailand. Thank you for joining us today. It's our live show. We do this every morning at 9 a.m. Thai time. Bill, let's get into some of these questions. We've got so many coming through.
I'm a little hesitant to say, hey, Tim, because there's two of you, but I know, Tim, down under the vaccination rate, I think at last count was about 3% for the second vaccinations. Why do you think the rollout's so slow across Australia? We've seen the issues about AstraZeneca now for people over 60 as well.
Tim Shaw.
Big challenge, Bill. Current total numbers are that 6.3 million Australians have had the first dose and 1.8 million have had the second dose. So you're right. We're looking at around 3% of the population, and that was focused very much on the ages 70 plus group. And we all know why. The challenges for respiratory infection and comorbidity. They wanted to focus on older Australians to be able to protect them and to be able to protect access to intensive care units in hospitals and, of course, avoid intubation. But, Bill, unfortunately, the politics has got in the way of a speedy rollout. Our Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said, this is not a race, this is not a competition. They negotiated a deal with AstraZeneca for the local manufacturer of AstraZeneca, but allegations that Pfizer doses in big numbers were offered last year and that there was a delay in the signing of that contract. But having said that, this latest lockdown of the largest city in Australia is very much pursuing more Australians. They want to get vaccinated, and the government last Friday announced that Australians under the age of 40 could access the AstraZeneca vaccine, even though there were issues of potential blood clot. We are currently ranked the lowest in the OECD countries in terms of vaccination levels, and that's something that the government, not only the federal government, but state governments, are trying to address right now.
Okay, Bill's got a question from one of our viewers.
Tim, we've got some messages. We got some questions from Gencan. I'm sure that you will mention Australians cannot travel overseas. What is the situation as an Australian if you want to travel overseas?
So, Australians must apply through the Home Affairs Department for an exemption to travel, and it must be for a number of reasons. That it's essential national interest. So, for example, there may be military or, heaven forbid, those involved in the cloak and dagger activities. If you want to travel overseas to be with a dying relative, a very, very difficult exemption process applies, and you've got to be arguably away for more than 3 months. Now, this has put pressure on the 40+ thousand Australians or permanent residents, Australian citizens permanent residents that want to come back to Australia. And there have been many delays, particularly within the Indian Australian community, of being able to leave India. There's been delays in Australians or permanent resident Australians living in the United Kingdom. It's difficult, it's complex, it's expensive bill, and more Australians are calling for a priority to be given to those Australian citizens that cannot return, including those Australian citizens registered in Thailand with the Australian Embassy, to be able to access more flights. But a problem on flight numbers announced last Friday.
I was going to mention that people wondering why on earth we're talking about Australia. Australia has actually been one of the most consistent travellers to Thailand for the past 2 or 3 decades. In the past 2 decades, some 600,000 to 900,000 Australian tourists have come to Thailand every single year. So they've been batting above their weight for a small population. They've certainly been big supporters of the land of smiles. Bill, you got another question?
Sure. This one in from Daniel. Given the number of tourists will be less in Thailand this year than in 2020, do you think the GDP this year will be negative?
Well, we don't know if the number of tourists will be less this year. I mean, if the Sandbox is successful in Phuket, if it's rolled out as a blueprint to other parts of Thailand, then we imagine we might have more travellers in Thailand this year than we did last year. We won't know until the end of the year. But I would say that tourism, whilst it's very important, is not the only thing that Thailand does as part of its GDP. And I noticed last week that there's been a 17% rise in exports for cars, for example. So that'll have a positive effect on the GDP. So difficult to answer the question at this stage, but I think we'll probably end up with more tourists this year than last year. Daniel, that's my thoughts anyway.
Maybe a question down to Tim. I know, Tim, there's a real property boom. Despite this, despite the pandemic and everything else, property prices have never been higher than in Australia. How do you explain that? At the time of a crisis, people are still buying houses. The economy seems to be doing kind of okay.
More than 500,000 Australians who were living overseas have returned to Australia since last March. Some of those Australians and permanent residents do own their own homes, but many of them have been re-entering the Australian market, and that's put pressure on local supply. And in supply and demand on property, the less supply, the higher the price. The average home in Sydney now is worth more than 1 million Australian dollars.
You're
and in
joking. Goodness gracious.
The part of Sydney that I live in, you're now seeing property prices for an average 3 or 4 bedroom home in a sunny seaside suburb like Newport, where I'm broadcasting today, more than 2 million Australian dollars. Australians love investing in real estate, but Bill, that's supply and demand. With even more Australians returning here, it's going to put even more pressure on domestic house prices.
Right.
So the question would be, if an Australian wanted to come to Thailand at the moment as part of the Sandbox or as it's rolled out to other parts of the country, what would an Australian family pay for a holiday?
Great question. And on those tourism stats, 1 million Australians visited Thailand in 2019. The average mum and dad and the 2 kids would have probably spent around $2,500 on airfares, and I expect they would have spent $2,500 for a 2-week fantastic holiday in Phuket, shopping, great food, the land of smiles, that welcoming heart of Thai people. But now, if I wanted to travel to Phuket, I'd have to go via Bangkok. There's no direct flights. I'd be lucky to try and pick up that seat on one of the departing Thai airlines flights that are leaving empty. Some Thais are still returning to their birth country, permanent resident Thais and Australian citizens. But we're going to be spending more than $2,000 each one way. So that average family of 4 isn't going to return to Thailand before February, March, April of next year, unless a few things happen. The Thai and the Australian governments make some very strong agreements about protecting vaccinated tourists on their arrival in Thailand and on their return to their home country of Australia. I think hotels and those wonderful tourism organisations, particularly in Phuket, will get together and be smart about costs and safety health safety. You're in the Sandbox. I can go anywhere around Phuket, but I can't even do that in my own city of Sydney now. I've got to have 5 good reasons to leave my home. And so big challenges ahead. I don't expect an Australian family will be able to travel to Phuket for at least 8, 10 or 12 months. I'd say Easter of 20 was the earliest.
Bill?
Maybe just a quick question, Tim. If I had an Australian family of 4 and I was going from Melbourne to, say, Byron Bay, certainly hotel rooms and everything else, how much would that cost maybe?
It's a great question, Bill. I would probably expect that family of 4 to drive about 12 to 14 hours minimum to get to Byron Bay, because at the moment those domestic airline seats would cost probably $1,500, maybe $2,000 return from Melbourne
Goodness
to
gracious.
Byron Bay. The major domestic airline Qantas, of course, which is an international carrier as well, has got competition from Virgin Australia, from Rex Airlines, and even Jetstar now, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Qantas. But Bill, there were some cheap seats available, which was partially federal government subsidised, but those seats sold out very, very quickly. And the holiday destination accommodation providers, back to supply and demand, there's a great demand for those hotel beds in Byron Bay, and prices have shot up. And also, we had the Queensland government lock down their borders to New South Wales travellers. So with Victoria, same deal. If New South Wales in lockdown, I can't get over the Victorian border by car or even if I flew out.
All right, let's have another quick break on Good Morning Thailand. We've got Bill here, we've got Tim in Sydney. We're talking about the problems of Australians travelling back to Thailand, and we'll be back to more of your questions right after this.
Want to keep up to date with what's happening in Thailand? Download the Thaiger app. It works on both Android and Apple. And it's free. All the latest news, videos, and information at one click from your phone. Go to your Play Store or App Store and download now.
Thank you for joining us on Good Morning Thailand. It's Monday, episode number 31. We do this every morning. Bill, we're here at Cafe Waya until Wednesday.
Right.
Where will we go next?
Maybe south? Big Island.
Well, south in Phuket.
Yes, exactly.
I thought
Head
you were
south.
suggesting Malaysia
No,
or something.
Maybe not.
No, okay.
Not for the moment.
Well, yeah, we'll try and come up with somewhere else to go. Maybe you've got a suggestion. If you'd like to suggest where we can go, be nice. Then you can try that. Julia says Australia is actually registered as a US corporation. Google it. Random things people say. Aussies won't go until the price comes back to realistic prices for Asia. Cheap Charlies just won't do it.
Maybe on that question, Tim, you're sitting in Australia. How much do people actually want to leave the country and get out and go visit somewhere else?
Australians love to travel, Bill. 11 million Australians jumped on an aircraft and flew internationally in 2019. At the National Press Club 2 weeks ago, I met up with former Australian ambassador to Thailand, Paul Rebillard, who served prior to Ambassador McKinnon taking up that role. He agreed with me that Australians are chomping at the bit to be able to go away and to travel. They love their country, but they love warm climates during winter. So ordinarily, we would have seen Monday, Wednesday, and we would have seen departures every week from Sydney and Melbourne on direct flights on Jetstar to Phuket on an A330 carrying nearly 300 passengers. I'm gonna put this out there, Bill, and your expertise in this area. I think it's going to take, once the Thai government, the Australian government agree on Sandbox and quarantine rules, we're going to see full chartered aircraft flying out of capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, under strict Sandbox agreements, and that'll be a way back, but it's got to be affordable. A family of 4 is not going to pay $5,000 return in air tickets to be sitting in PPE or masks, not being able to interact on the aircraft, remaining in their seats. And the risk we run at the moment is if these restrictions on arrivals back into Australia, a lot of international airlines are going to give up on flying into Australia. And that warning came after the cut in return passengers from 6,070 down to 3,025. that was announced last Friday.
I've got a thought experiment for the two of you. So imagine you are Prime Minister for a day, Tim and Bill. Congratulations, by the way.
Oh.
So I'm going to give you the opportunity to remove or change one of the requirements or restrictions for travel in the Sandbox at the moment. And there are quite a few restrictions. So Bill, first, if you had one thing that you could change in the Sandbox, what would it be?
Certificates of entry, COEs. Make it easier. Make somebody to make a decision, be able to come back without applying visa on arrival status. Make it easy. From that decision you want to fly to come in, it's seamless with that.
Yeah, the certificate of entry basically is tied up with this emergency decree that exists
Sure.
in Thailand at the moment. So it's not sort of a normal government situation. We've got this emergency decree, which means the government are able to sort of change things very quickly and nimbly if they want to. The only way that you can get back into Thailand at the moment is with a certificate of entry. Tim, what would you be doing if you were able to change one thing? Prime Minister Tim.
Prime Minister of Thailand or Australia, Tim?
Prime
Give me a
Minister,
choice
you're
here.
Prime Minister of Thailand for the day.
Congratulations.
Sawadee krap.
Congratulations.
Kop kun krap. What we do need is an absolute acceptance of a vaccine passport, and that vaccine passport is going to be critical. I would be working with my own health authorities in Thailand to be able to announce those countries where we accept that you've been doubly vaccinated, that you are equipped with affordable COVID travel insurance, and this is where a lot of work's got to be done. Vaccine certificates and affordable COVID recognised travel insurance.
Okay, Bill, got some more comments?
Well, we've had a lot of comments this week. You know, Richard Barrow certainly was talking about this yesterday in his columns as well about the taxi issue. Again, that taxis have come up at the airport again in terms of overpricing from Thailand, even with the Sandbox back.
Only 4 days into the Sandbox, and the old taxi mafia in Phuket is back to their old games. They just couldn't keep themselves clean for a couple of weeks, maybe. I'm not surprised. Yeah, of course, it's all about the money. You're right.
I think sadly people have asked what's changed in Phuket and what hasn't changed. The beaches are in good shape and certain other things, but unfortunately the taxi situation has not changed. That certainly is something that for tourism to go forward really needs to be addressed, Tim.
I was wondering over the past 14 months, just wandering around the island, the two things that I've really noticed that are missing, and I haven't really missed them personally, but all the red tuk-tuks and all those grey passenger vans that are all turbocharged and seem to be the racing cars of Phuket.
Right.
But I don't know where they all went for 14 months. They literally vanished. There must be some big garage in the middle of the island that we don't know about.
Well, they're back. Here's a question in from Dennis W. Because the Thai government is copying so much slack from the public with how they're handling the COVID situation and letting foreigners, so they're redirecting the blame. What do you think? Are foreigners going to be the blame game with the Sandbox for letting COVID back in, or is Bangkok clearly a bigger issue for them?
Well, I think the science is showing that we know what the causes are of the outbreaks. The outbreak back in December was basically the migrants coming across the borders and bringing COVID with them. But if you think about it, it wasn't really the migrants' fault. It was these traffickers and the people bringing the cheap labour into Thailand, and they were Thais. And the latest outbreak, the one that started at the start of April, started around the party areas of Thong Lo with the girly clubs, basically high-class brothels, and that's where that emerged, and that was Thai people as well. So they can blame the foreigners if they like, but the science is quite clear, and the government knows that.
Another interesting question we had incoming the other day, we were talking about the restaurants in Bangkok who were going to defy the order and still reopen.
Yes.
We've seen that in the press as well, and the government threatening a shutdown again if they actually violate the laws. I think Bangkok's a basket case in terms of restaurants, in terms of anything open right now.
It's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
The restaurants are revolting. But they didn't. But it would be interesting to see if all the restaurants in Thailand said, we've had enough of this, we're going to reopen. It would be very difficult, and it would be very bad optic internationally to see the police storming in and closing down restaurants.
I know, Tim, here in Thailand, we've seen a real spike in COVID deaths, certainly over the past week. Tim, in Australia, what's the situation for COVID-related deaths?
A total of 910 Australians lost their lives, Bill, since March of 2020. More than 650, nearly 700, were related to infections in aged care facilities. The hotel quarantine system had breaches as a result. For example, a security guard went back to his place of residence, which may have been a high-rise residential tower in Melbourne. As a result of that, the infection leaked into aged care facilities. And unfortunately, the federal government, who are responsible for quarantine in aged care facilities, did not act enough. So more than 600 Australians older than 70 years of age lost their lives. A couple of points on this, though, that ultimately the number of deaths related to influenza, particularly in Australia, has dropped. Last year, the number of Australians that died that had their deaths certified by a general practitioner, which when someone does pass away, dropped by 2.7%. So I think there needs to be some balance to this issue. Influenza takes out thousands of Australian lives each year, and because we've been in lockdown, practicing better hand and mask hygiene, less people have actually contracted influenza. So the question going forward, 910 deaths, it's not the 500,000 deaths in the United States, 6,000 in the United Kingdom, or the 24,000 in Canada. 910 deaths for a population of $25.5 million is a remarkably low figure. But as our government officials continue to say, every death is a tragedy. And what they're focusing on is measures and policies that will prevent as many deaths as possible. Under these new regimes, basically no deaths from COVID, one this year, and we're now in July here in Australia.
Just barreling through some of these comments, Genkin says, COE is nonsense, really is. John Paul says, it will pass. Buffalo Dan says, who in their right mind wants to go to Australia anyway? Brad says, good one. Not sure what you're referring to, but thanks, Brad. Paul says, dirty old man, that's cheating. Oh, they're talking to each other. This is a whole new show just in the comments section. Stevie says, I wish Thailand would screen for HIV sex travellers. And we've got Brad saying, yes, take away the COE. Bill, you got some comments there?
There's another question from Bipolar Punt, one of our regular watchers. What do you know of the COVID alert for passengers on domestic flights from Bangkok to Phuket?
Yeah, there was a situation, in fact, there's been 2 flights over the past couple of weeks where the airline and the government and the Department of Transport have put out an alert saying that they have found an infected traveller, and they've alerted people on the airline, all the staff. They've put their staff into quarantine. So there's been quite a hullabaloo, and in both cases they were flights from Bangkok back to Phuket. So it seems that there is a lot of focus on these particular flights coming into Phuket at the moment because of the Sandbox.
And I think, well, yeah, not saying that word, but I think there is a bit of a stigma now for people coming from Bangkok and traveling here as well. It's almost
dirty Bangkokians.
It's almost Bangkok shaming. When somebody walks in the room with a from Bangkok, people automatically cover their mouths. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, because with these rising cases in Bangkok and the propensity in the past for the government to jump on them with restrictions, closing the restaurants down, alcohol bans, etc., it's going to be interesting to see if they can weather this week. I sort of predict, sadly, that we probably will see a rising number of cases in Bangkok. This Delta variant seems to be doing some damage. Will the government make that big leap and introduce further restrictions? And if they do, what effect is that going to have on the Sandbox?
Keeping Thailand in the headlines certainly is. Tim, from you're viewing Thailand from abroad, and in terms of what's the perception down under of the government's handling of the COVID crisis and the reopening of Thailand?
Thailand and Australia have an very important relationship, and so Australians that do follow Southeast Asian governmental politics and decisions, I think many have recognised that the effort by the Thai government to create the Sandbox is a very positive policy. And certainly our Southeast Asian desk at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra will be watching closely. In terms of our relationship with Thailand, you've got to remember His Majesty the King studied here in Australia and in fact went to the Royal Military College in Dunchurin. And that closeness between the Australian and Thai people has been in place for many, many decades. I think that the Australian government is focusing, as it should properly do, on affairs here in Australia, as the Thai government is. Our tourism GDP is much lower than Thailand's GDP. I think 15% of Thailand's GDP from tourism-related activities.
Right.
But again, what you'll see is pressure from Australians who don't feel inhibited in criticising their government on talkback radio or on live YouTube programs. The reality is we're going to see more and more Australians saying, come on, I'm doubly vaccinated. I want to go to Thailand. I want to see my family and friends. When can I do it? And I get back to, I think, see trial charter flights in the mid to distant future where Australians will be able to come to and from the kingdom with a great anticipation.
We'll soon know. Sexina says helmet motorcycle accidents kill more people in Thailand than the C-19 flu. Just reminding people, of course, that COVID-19 is not a flu. Don't know how many times we have to say this. It's a coronavirus. It's quite a different beastie altogether. Bill, some more questions?
Safari in from Paul Rainwater. What a load of crap opening this playground for the rich, vaccinating the entire population while the rest of Thailand and millions of people are begging for the vaccine, right? The hell with Phuket.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, at some stage, Thailand, well, everywhere else in the world, is going to have to find a way to reopen. And the Sandbox is a way that Thailand sees that it can safely reopen. And yeah, it's a bit of an experiment. It's going to be forming a blueprint. There will be some rough edges, and there'll be some things that will work and some things that won't. But every country is going to have to go through this process. Around Southeast Asia, it looks like Thailand is the one country that's sort of doing it first.
We got a note in from Adam Yellen, okay? Actually, sent this 3 times. I've got my COE and heading to Phuket on the 23rd. What's open? Any good restaurants or lounges? High-end massage spas?
Well, yeah, massage spas, some are open. I know there's lots of restaurants open. The interesting thing is, though, the sort of the party central, Patong, is probably the most badly affected at the moment and the place where you're going to see probably the biggest change. But if you come to a place like Cherngtalay, where we are, which is sort of in the centre of the island on the west coast.
Running Thailand the rest of the week.
Oh, question without notice, thanks.
Question, what exactly? Just go with it.
It's a surprise, Bill.
Okay.
And
surprises are good.
We'll tell you tomorrow. I just wanted to mention, Tim and Bill, regionally the situation. In Cambodia, they've shut their borders down to Thailand and Vietnam as of yesterday. So it looks like they're going into a bit of a lockdown situation. The cases going up there. In Vietnam, this is an ongoing situation, but the government are basically kicking out all the foreigners on tourist visas. Either tourist visas, the people that have been just coming in, going out, and doing border runs basically for many, many years in some cases, and also those tourists that were stuck there in Vietnam at the start of the COVID lockdowns and have been given sort of monthly extensions. They're now basically being kicked out as well. So around Southeast Asia, things are not looking good at the moment. Malaysia's still in lockdown. The cases going up. Singapore seems to be the only place that's got things sort of under control at the moment.
I think Singapore is also saying they're trying to learn to live with it as well. They're saying they're going to reopen, but it's going to have to be coexisting with a pandemic. That's the only way forward.
So it looks like management is the way forward for a lot of these countries who are sort of coming to grasp. If you were to sort of put a sort of a slogan to how Australia is coping with it, Tim, what would you say? I mean, I'm saying Thailand is managing COVID.
Australia has certainly taken a very careful approach. It's seen the devastation and loss of lives in Europe, United Kingdom and Australia. We're a first world nation that has secured tens of millions of doses of AstraZeneca, which we now manufacture locally, Pfizer, Moderna, and of course the new Novavax. We have 51 million doses on order and they'll be delivered later this year. What the G7 nations agreed when they met in Cornwall, including the sideline meetings of Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, was that the G7 want to focus on those nations being able to help other nations, and particularly in the Pacific and even in Indonesia, some 4 million AstraZeneca doses will be sent to combat the outbreak of COVID in Indonesia. So it's still steady as she goes, but the Australian Prime Minister and his government, under pressure from the states and territories last Friday, woke up to the fact that it's not a stroll to vaccinations, it's an expeditious, faster rollout of vaccinations. And we've seen in this latest lockdown, in the biggest city in Australia, double the number of people seeking vaccination, and that is going to continue this week and next. They're hoping that they can vaccinate the entire nation of Australia, those adults amongst the 25.3 million Australians, by the end of the year. A lot of work to be done. As Bill pointed out, less than 3% of the adult population with 2 doses. Faster rollout. The borders will remain shut, and the limited travel by Australians probably not released till least April, May next year, 2022.
Thanks, Tim. JD Media says, any updates about transfers from Bangkok? This is an interesting situation. They were talking about having a transit terminal to cope with people who were arriving in Bangkok who wanted to come to the Sandbox. That hasn't emerged at the moment, so we can't really give you any information. If you do arrive in Bangkok at the moment, you will have to do 14 days in an ASQ hotel.
I think, Tim, that's going to come forward certainly with the Samui Sandbox coming up on the 15th, where there'll have to be a sealed route going through Bangkok as well. So
so it'll probably happen after the 15th. Any quick ones? We'll just do two quick, one each. So off you go, Bill.
From Richard McCormick, why are you trying to avoid the subject of the opening? Because it was slightly less than fabulous. Are we avoiding the subject?
Well, you were. Look, as far as the opening of the Sandbox is concerned, the TAT, as is their wont, gave some fairly sort of magical figures a week out, and then they were saying there was some 1,500 people coming on the first day. It was 342. I think we can say that about 1,600 people have arrived over the past 4 days, and 1,600 people is a lot more than nothing. So I think Phuket was always going to have a start. It seems to be a fairly consistent start. They haven't had any people arriving with COVID. So this number will slowly build.
I think one of the feedback is from talking to people who have come through the Sandbox is it's a long delay at the airport. It's taking anywhere from an hour to 2 hours to go through the airport. There's a little confusion in terms of where to go and what to do next in that whole process. So if there's any messaging for TAT or anybody out there, it's please improve that process, try to get people through faster and be clear in the directions coming through the airport. So again, it's a work in progress.
Julia says, I think Thaiger should publish vaccination data alongside COVID cases. The system is ramping well. Yes, we actually do publish, I think, each day in the afternoon, the provincial totals, which includes the vaccine totals. I'll double check on that and make sure that we do, because we do want to keep you up to date with the vaccine rollout. All right, I think we're done for the day.
I've got one final question for Tim. Tim, you used to live in Thailand. What do you miss the most?
I used to live in Thailand. What I miss is what millions of Australians miss. It's the Thai people. They're so laid back. They're so happy. They're welcoming. I miss the food, of course. The climate at this time in Australia, currently 12 degrees, with a high of 16 degrees centigrade. I know where I'd prefer to be. I'd love to be at Nai Han Beach and walking up to the old Phuket club and having a cocktail with them. The beaches are beautiful, and we know the West Coast at this time of year is stunning, and they look so clean and inviting. But again, Bill, the affordability of being able to come to Thailand, to be able to experience the culture, the people, and an affordable winter escape for Australians everywhere. So that's what I miss the most, the people and the food.
I'd be missing the mango shakes. Senior Frank said, why don't you have production staff vet and feed you questions from the chat? Having on-air talent distracted by reading through the chat is kind of weird. You're absolutely right, Senior Frank. We can't afford production staff. We just do this on the smell of an oily rag. We do our best to try and speak to our guests to try and engage you. It's not a perfect situation, but it's the best we can do. And until we can afford to do so, we won't be having any specialised staff or anything. Good heavens.
Looking forward to having Jay tomorrow.
Yes, we've got Jay sitting in the hot seat.
Tuesday is Jay Day, and then Abel's going to be here on Wednesday.
Yes, they'll be the ones who are distracted by having to read the viewer questions. Tim Shaw from Australia, thank you very much for joining us.
And happy July 4th to our American friends that are watching us live right around the United States. Great to be with you. And Kop Kun Krap. I hope to see you all again soon.
It's probably still July the 4th for the people watching in America. So happy July the 4th, happy Independence
July
Day.
4th.
And to you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Thailand.
And thank you very much for joining us on Good Morning Thailand. We will be back again tomorrow here at Cafe Waya, and we thank you for watching.